I could have jumped. Everyone could have jumped. But Jim was still in his seat, and I couldn't leave him. From John Morgan's post-war testimony, 1944, over Germany in a B-17, the co-pilot was badly wounded. Morgan flew the aircraft back to England with one hand for 6 hours. July 28, 1943. England, an airbase, early morning. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a heavy aircraft. 4 engines, 9 crew members, capable of carrying thousands of kilograms of bombs. A giant. But on that particular morning, when Lieutenant John Morgan climbed aboard, he wasn't thinking about bombs. He was thinking about the route, Germany, getting there and getting back. Morgan came from Texas. He was 23 years old, a quiet man, didn't talk much. The men in his unit knew him as someone who kept his head. He didn't panic. At least he never appeared to have panicked yet. Sitting beside him was co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Nelson. The two had flown together before. Between them had grown that strange kind of partnership that forms in a cockpit, the kind where you don't need words. Each one already knew what the other was about to do. That morning's target was Oschersleben, deep inside Germany, in a sector where the defenses were known to be heavy. The Air Force had a term for missions like this: maximum effort. What that meant in plain language was that the expected losses were high. Morgan knew that. Nelson knew it too, but that was part of the job. The aircraft rolled down the runway, joined the formation, and headed toward Germany.
In the summer of 1943, the American 8th Air Force was intensifying its strategic bombing operations deep into German territory. Survival rates for B-17 crews during this period were extremely low. The standard tour of duty required a pilot to complete 25 missions before rotating home, but on average, many crews were lost before reaching that number. The Oschersleben area was one of the most heavily defended sectors in the entire German air defense network. A significant portion of the formation that took off that day did not come back.
When they crossed into Germany, the German fighters appeared. At first, they were small dots on the horizon. Then they grew. Then they were coming from every direction. FW-190s and BF-109s tore into the formation. Gunfire, explosions, engine noise, everything ran together into a single wall of sound. Morgan was working to hold the aircraft steady. If the formation broke apart, everything got worse. Staying together was the only way to survive. Then a blast hit the cockpit. Glass shattered. Metal gave way. Wind punched through the opening. Morgan was momentarily blinded. His eyes filled with tears. A second or two passed. He pulled his hands from his face and looked around. Nelson wasn't moving in his seat. He had taken a head wound. It looked serious. His eyes were closed. He was trying to reach for the controls, but his hands weren't responding. "Jim!" Morgan shouted. Nothing came back. The aircraft was shaking. The German fighters were still pressing the attack, and the co-pilot was out. Morgan got on the radio. "Cockpit's been hit. Co-pilot is down." The voice that came back was short. "What's your situation?" Morgan paused for a moment. He looked out the window. He looked at Nelson. He looked at his own hands. "We'll manage," he said.
Cockpit damage on a B-17 was among the most dangerous scenarios a crew could face. Having 2 pilots actively on duty at all times was a fundamental requirement built into the aircraft's design. Flying a B-17 with a single pilot was technically possible, but extremely demanding. The aircraft's weight, the sensitivity of the hydraulic systems, and the physical toll of long-distance flight all pushed the limits of what one person could sustain. The situation Morgan found himself in that day was one that even training scenarios rarely covered.
A few minutes had passed. Nelson still wasn't moving. Voices were coming through the intercom from the rest of the crew. The bombardier, the navigator, the tail gunner. Everyone knew what was happening, and everyone was waiting for the same thing: the order to jump. One of the other aircraft in the formation pulled alongside. The pilot came over the radio. "Morgan, what's your situation? Can you bail out?" Morgan looked at Nelson. He was breathing. He was alive, but he couldn't move. And to bail out, he would need to be able to move. Morgan made a decision. He wasn't jumping. It hadn't come from a calculation. There was no logic being worked through. He just looked at Nelson and thought, I brought this man here. I put him on this aircraft, and I am not leaving him behind. He got back on the radio. We can't jump. We're continuing. The pilot in the formation stayed quiet for a moment. Then, understood. Morgan tightened his grip on the controls. His right hand had been moving across to Nelson's side of the cockpit from time to time, trying to keep him steady. His left hand was flying the aircraft. One hand. Ahead of him was the route back to England. Approximately 6 hours. The German fighters were still out there, and the aircraft was damaged. One engine not running properly. The cockpit glass gone. Wind pouring through the opening. Temperature below -30. Morgan took a slow breath and flew.
Morgan's decision was a difficult one to evaluate against standard military procedure. Protocol in a severe damage situation prioritized getting the crew out alive. But leaving a wounded crew member behind created its own ethical conflict within that same framework. The attempt to fly a B-17 single-handed was theoretically possible, but physically punishing in practice. The aircraft's hydraulic systems and the weight of the control inputs made sustained one-handed operation an extraordinary physical challenge over any extended period of time.
The first hour was the hardest. The German fighters were still on them. Morgan was working to hold the aircraft steady while keeping one eye on Nelson. Every now and then, Nelson would move slightly, make a sound, then go still again. Morgan talked to him. "Jim, can you hear me? We're almost home." Nothing came back, but Morgan kept talking. The silence was worse. In the second hour, the port engine started to shake. Morgan looked at the instruments. The fuel was dropping faster than it should. Something had taken a hit somewhere. He ran the numbers in his head. Would there be enough? Maybe, maybe not. In the third hour, his hands started to go numb. The cold was coming through the broken glass, -30 degrees, and the gloves weren't enough. Morgan began rotating his hands. He warmed one while flying with the other, then switched. In the fourth hour, Nelson opened his eyes, just for a moment. He looked around with a confused expression, saw Morgan, tried to say something, but nothing came out. Morgan leaned toward him. "I'm here, Jim. We're going home, hold on." Nelson's eyes closed again, but for Morgan that was enough. By the fifth hour, the formation was long gone. He was flying alone now. The English coastline still wasn't visible, but the navigator was feeding him the heading over the intercom. He was on the right track. In the sixth hour, the sea appeared below, the English Channel. Morgan exhaled. For the first time that day, he actually exhaled.
The technical problems Morgan faced over those 6 hours had stacked on top of each other without stopping. A damaged engine, dropping fuel, a shattered cockpit, and single pilot control of an aircraft designed for two. In normal B-17 operations, both pilots were actively engaged at all times. Morgan completing this flight alone placed him in a category that Air Force records of the period rarely had to account for. The rest of the crew stayed at their positions throughout, keeping the aircraft's defensive guns manned and doing what they could to support him from their stations.
When they reached the English coast, the fuel was almost gone. Morgan called in an emergency landing request over the radio. He asked for the coordinates of the nearest runway. The navigator gave them. Morgan turned the aircraft toward it. When the runway came into view, his hands were shaking. 6 hours of flying with one hand. His fingers were numb, his wrist had swollen, his shoulder was throbbing. But now the most critical moment had arrived. The landing, with a damaged aircraft, with one hand, on a runway he'd never used before. Morgan took a slow breath. He ran through the standard landing procedures in his mind, but those procedures were written for two pilots. Right now, there was only him. The aircraft descended. The engine note changed. The wheels touched down. It was a hard landing. The aircraft lurched, lost its line for a moment, then kept rolling down the runway and stopped. Silence. Morgan let go of the controls. He looked at his hands. He couldn't feel them anymore. The crew came running from the back. Nelson was lifted out on a stretcher. He was still alive. He was taken to hospital. He went through surgery. A long recovery was ahead of him, but he was going to make it. When Morgan climbed down from the aircraft, his legs weren't working properly. He stood there for a while, on the runway, looking at the plane. The damage was extensive. Wings, fuselage, cockpit. How this aircraft had flown that day was difficult to understand. but it had flown. He told a journalist afterward, "Everyone asked me why I didn't jump. I always gave them the same answer. Jim was still in there. I don't have another answer."
The medical assessment carried out after this mission found serious frostbite in Morgan's right hand and muscle damage in his shoulder. Despite this, Morgan returned to flight duty within a short period. Robert Nelson recovered after a long course of treatment. The two stayed in contact for the rest of their lives. The first thing Nelson said to Morgan when they were reunited was, "Why didn't you jump?" Morgan's answer was the same one he always gave, "Because you wouldn't have."
The story spread across the airbase quickly. Crews were talking about it. Officers were talking about it. And eventually, word reached Washington. A pilot had refused to leave a wounded man behind, had flown a B-17 single-handed for 6 hours, and had brought it home. The Medal of Honor recommendation followed not long after. Morgan didn't say much at the ceremony. He said thank you. He stood to attention. He stepped back. He wasn't comfortable with the attention. But afterward, speaking to younger pilots, he said this, "This medal isn't for me. It's for every man who was on that aircraft that day." But Morgan's story wasn't only a story about sacrifice. It pointed to something deeper. War teaches people many things: the survival instinct, self-preservation, getting yourself out alive. All of that is normal. All of it is human. But occasionally something else surfaces, putting yourself at risk in order not to leave someone else behind. You could call that sacrifice, or you could just call it being human. Morgan was that second kind of person, and it had shown itself over 6 hours in the air, with one hand, with frozen fingers, at 30,000 feet over the North Sea.
John Morgan's Medal of Honor was recorded as one of the most significant decorations awarded to Air Force personnel during the Second World War. The documentation of human decisions made during strategic bombing operations became an important resource for historians studying that period. Morgan's story was also used as a reference point in Air Force training materials, as a concrete example of crew loyalty under extreme pressure. Many similar decisions were made throughout the war, but most were never recorded.
John Morgan went home to Texas after the war. He farmed. He lived quietly. His neighbors knew him as an ordinary man. He didn't talk much, didn't boast, rarely brought up that day. But old pilots would come by from time to time. They'd drink coffee, sit quietly together, and sometimes that day would come up, just between them. Nobody else would have understood it anyway. Nelson came too sometimes. The two of them could sit for hours without saying anything. Then Nelson would get up to leave. He'd turn at the door. "I still don't understand why you didn't jump," he'd say. Morgan would laugh. "I know," he'd say. "You would have done the same." That short exchange says everything. The decisions made in war are rarely the product of careful calculation. There's no grand strategy behind them. There's just a moment. And whatever comes out of a person in that moment is what comes out. What came out of Morgan that day was Nelson. He passed away in 2004. He was 84 years old. In his small town in Texas, old pilots came to the funeral. Elderly men, moving slowly, quiet. They looked at each other and said very little, because some things don't fit into words. Nobody knows where that B-17 is today. It was probably scrapped long ago, broken down into pieces, melted, turned into something else entirely. But that 6-hour flight is still somewhere, between two men, over coffee, in a doorway, and in the answer to every, "Why didn't you jump?"
John Morgan's story continues to be referenced today in discussions of both military history and leadership ethics. The decision he made that day is studied in Air Force academies as a case study in individual responsibility and crew loyalty under pressure. Morgan's Medal of Honor citation is held in the United States National Archives. The story remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of the human dimension of war, and of what a person is capable of when the only thing guiding them is the man sitting in the seat next to them.